There are many places in Middle-earth that, if they existed in the modern day, they would have numerous governmental travel warnings associated with them. As a result, it wasn't hard to find 10 places in Middle-earth that are extremely dangerous to pretty much anyone. Well, at least anyone that's good. So in this video, we go through the list and determine what makes these places so dangerous. Before I get started, I just want to clarify two things. Firstly, this video will be dated as of the time of the War of the Ring, so that excludes places in Beleriand from the First Age, like Nan Dungatheb, a place which I consider to be one of the worst places to have ever existed. It also means we must exclude places like Angmar, which would have been a very dangerous place for much of the Third Age, but was apparently uninhabited by the end of the age, and therefore won't make the list. And secondly, while this list is vaguely a ranking, I do want to point out that it's purely a matter of personal opinion. It's hard to quantify what makes a place dangerous, and realistically, I think many of the places on this list could be swapped around without too much controversy. So anyway, let's get into it. Number 10, the Paths of the Dead. The White Mountains between Gondor and Rohan were for long years inhabited by a mysterious people only known as the Men of the Mountains. These people were infamous for rejecting the call to fight against Sauron, and for breaking their oath, they were cursed by Isildur, becoming known as the Oathbreakers. Owing to their curse, they slowly dwindled away over the course of the Third Age, and by the end, they had seemingly died off. But their cursed spirits remained, haunting the Paths of the Dead, making it a place of terror. It should be pointed out that the Paths of the Dead aren't well understood. The paths were haunted by the ghosts of the Oathbreakers, and they were used to great effect in the War of the Ring. But while the ghosts caused enough terror that could possibly cause a man's heart to stop, we're unsure whether they could actually physically harm someone. Famously, Prince Baldur of Rohan entered the paths and vanished in the year 2570, and his corpse was later found by the Grey Company, his legs broken, his sword notched. But at that time, it seems there were still live men in the area, and Tolkien seems to imply that they were the ones who killed Baldur. So whether the paths were actually physically dangerous or just extremely terrifying by the time of the War of the Ring is unknown. However, given the history and ominous nature of the place, it's probably best not to try to even find out. Even if the ghosts were incapable of using deadly force on someone, there is more than one way to die in the dark, and there's temples deep in the mountains that should probably never see the light of day. Number 9, the Dead Marshes. The barren plain of Dagorlad was the location of some of Middle-earth's most terrible battles. Over time, the westernmost section of the plains were swallowed up by the encroaching marshlands of Nindalf, exhuming the corpses of those warriors who fell there. From that point on, this new marshland was known as the Dead Marshes. It was a place devoid of any life, monsters, orcs, even birds and beasts. But beyond the normal dangers that marshlands pose, like getting lost, drowning, possibly disease, the real danger of the Dead Marshes quickly becomes apparent. While there's no physical creatures waiting to devour you, the Dead Marshes still seem to be a place that has been heavily affected by dark magic. The most infamous part of the Dead Marshes are the bodies of warriors from ancient battles that lie just beneath the water's surface. But there's evidence that suggests that these aren't even real. They're illusions or phantoms possibly created by Sauron. Combined with the floating, flickering lights that lurk in the bogs, it seems that the Dead Marshes' real danger is of a mental kind. An unfortunate traveller gets hypnotised by the lights and bodies and falls into the water where they drown and join the dead. So provided you keep your wits about you, and provided you have plenty of provisions and you know the way, the Dead Marshes aren't actually that dangerous. But if you're prepared or ignorant of the dangers that the marshes pose, you could end up dying in a non-violent but still horrifying manner. Many have. It's for this reason that most people just avoid the Dead Marshes, and thankfully the Dead Marshes are in a location where they are easy enough to avoid. Number 8, the Eon Moors. Eriador has been a land of rising and falling kingdoms, of civilization and of ruin, but throughout the ages there's one place that has never been truly tamed, the Eon Moors. The Eon Moors are an outcropping of the Misty Mountains, rugged highlands that are devoid of civilization, and more importantly, are apparently infested by trolls. And possibly not just trolls too. The Orcish stronghold of Mount Graham is often theorized to have been part of the Eon Moors, and from this mountain, the Orcs launched numerous invasions of the region. Keeping this in mind, you can see why the Eon Moors are such a dangerous place. It's a wild, remote, mountainous region that has never really felt the touch of civilization, so even without its inhabitants, it would still be a dangerous place. But when you add orcs and trolls to the mix, the danger multiplies tenfold, so much so that it's even a highly deadly place for the Dunedain Rangers, some of the most skilled men in Middle-earth. Aragorn's grandfather, Arador, was killed by trolls in this land. Even Aragorn states that he's not overly familiar with the lands north of the Coldfells. Yes, even a world-travelled veteran like Aragorn avoids the Eon Moors. Thankfully, because the Eon Moors are so remote, there's no reason to go there. There's no roads that lead there or even get close to leading there, and no one worth visiting lives there either. Unfortunately, even if you don't go to the Eon Moors might come to you. As I said earlier, orcs might have invaded from the region, provided that's where Mount Graham actually was, and trolls would come down from the mountains and make new homes in the old lands of Rhudaur, like the three Bilbo and company encountered in The Hobbit. Number 7. Eisen Guard. Unlike most other places that will appear on this list, the ringed fortress of Isengard was actually a fairly nice place for most of the Third Age. It was a Gondorian garrison for well over 2,000 years, but with the waning of Gondor, it eventually fell into the hands of the Dunlendings. They were painstakingly cleared out after the long winter, and then it ended up in the hands of Saruman, who kept a low profile there for the better part of 250 years. Even a year before the War of the Ring, one could go to Isengard and find nothing that was truly amiss. You might get a cold welcome from Saruman's guards, but your life wouldn't be in any immediate danger. But Saruman's open betrayal changed this, and Isengard rapidly transformed into a large, highly alert military camp. The luscious gardens and forests were cleared away, leaving nothing behind but a barren, industrialized wasteland that could belch vapors and fires from the forges beneath straight to the surface. Both sides of the valley were filled with enemies, and Saruman's forces could rapidly strike out down both sides of the River Isen, rendering Rohan's defences at the fords of Isen as obsolete. That being said, the danger of Isengard is a relatively mundane danger. Orcs, wargs, and evil men still very much capable of killing, but also capable of being killed themselves. There's no great monstrosities lurking around, there's no real dark magic at play, and while the land was devastated, Saruman had not been active long enough to truly corrupt it like Sauron had in other places. But the real danger of Isengard was in its central strategic location. If you wanted to avoid it, you had to take a long detour, such as the Fellowship being forced to cross the Misty Mountains because they couldn't go through the Gap of Rohan. And when Isengard attacked Rohan, it was merely a day's march away from some of Rohan's most populated lands, with no real natural barriers stopping them. Number 6. The Barrow Downs. The Barrow Downs were ancient burial mounds that were once the heartland of the Kingdom of Cardolan, one of Arnor's successor states. But during the war against Angmar, the region was devastated, and in 1636, its final inhabitants were killed or driven away by the deadly Great Plague. To further insult the memory of the Dunedain, the Witch King sent forth fell spirits from Angmar and Rhudaur to occupy the Barrow Downs, creating the horror that is the Barrow-wights, ancient corpses that have been reanimated. From that point on, the Barrow Downs were known as a place of death and terror, killing off many would-be adventurers and settlers, and driving off many more. We have a very good description of the Barrow Downs. It can come across as a normal, if slightly disquieting place at first, with treeless green hills often marked with strange standing stones. Unfortunately, spend too long there and the supernatural nature of the Downs quickly becomes apparent. You can sit for a short rest and accidentally drift off into a deep sleep. The air can become uncomfortably still, yet also cold. The fog can become so thick that it's almost impossible to hear or see through. By that point, you're trapped, and you're prey for the Barrow-wights. In the burial mounds themselves, the Barrow-wights wait. They are unmistakably evil, but are also strange, adorning their captives in jewellery and rich raiments before presumably sacrificing them. We don't know for sure, because we never got that far. Whatever might happen, the Barrow Downs were clearly not a place to be trifled with. Even if one could potentially overcome the physical threat of the Barrow-wights, one might not be able to overcome the dark magic that clearly permeated throughout the place. Like many other places on the list, the Barrow Downs were mostly avoidable, and it seemed that the Barrow-wights were either unwilling or unable to leave, considering the town of Bree was just down the road and survived for many years even after the Barrow-wights moved in. Number 5. The Withered Heath. If you've never heard of the Withered Heath, don't feel bad. It's a valley in one of the most remote regions of Middle-earth, the Grey Mountains. Little is known about the Grey Mountains. It was home to orcs by the War of the Ring, but years before that, it was the location of a prosperous but short-lived dwarven kingdom. This kingdom was destroyed, and the dwarves fled after fighting a losing war against the dragons. And speaking of dragons, that's exactly what the Withered Heath is, a breeding ground for dragons. So the Withered Heath being extremely dangerous shouldn't be surprising. This is a place that was once home to Smaug, the great dragon who sacked Erebor and destroyed Dale. Even though he was the last of the great dragons, his lesser kind remained and survived long afterwards. For this reason, we don't have any documented travels to the Withered Heath, but this doesn't mean people haven't tried. And you have to imagine, just how long could you survive in a valley full of dragons? And dragons aren't even the only threat. The mountains themselves were home to orcs, and being in the far north of Middle-earth, the Withered Heath was likely extremely cold as well. Fortunately, like many of the other places on this list, there's absolutely no reason to go to the Withered Heath. In fact, as probably the most remote place on this list, it's fairly easy to avoid. Unfortunately, that doesn't stop dragons from leaving the Heath and causing problems elsewhere, such as Scaffa or Smaug. And unfortunately, it means the largely unexplored and ore-rich Grey Mountains are a no-go zone for the foreseeable future. Number 4. Merkwood. Merkwood's history is a sad one. The mighty forest was once known as Greenwood the Great, home to many elves and men, but in the year 1000 of the Third Age, Sauron took up residence on the hill of Amon Lanc, once the elven capital of the kingdom, and it became known as Dol Guldur. From then onwards, the forest began to darken, eventually earning the name Merkwood. Outside of the northeastern section of the forest held by Thranduil's elves, and small enclaves held by the tough woodmen, Merkwood was an exceptionally dangerous place, and by the end of the Third Age, it was indisputably Sauron's second base of power. So yes, in terms of danger, Merkwood has it all. Orcs, wargs, trolls in service to Sauron. The mountains of Merkwood are said to be infested with monsters, and perhaps the most terrifying monsters of them all were the giant spiders, remnants of Shelob's old brood, making webs in the dark trees. Even without the orcs and monsters, the forest itself had become corrupted over the last 2,000 years. It was a maze of traps and enchantments where one could easily get lost and simply die from starvation, dehydration, or exposure. And unlike many other places on this list, Merkwood was hard to avoid. It was massive, and it perfectly divided the lands of Rhovanion, acting as a barrier to the populations on either side of it. One could potentially pass north or south of the forests, but these lands were just as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than the forest itself. There were paths through the forest, but these paths were dubious at best. The main historical path, Men-I Naugrim, the Old Forest Road, had become overgrown, was used by the enemy, and the eastern end of the path disappeared into the marshes of the Kelduin. Even the safer, more northern elven path passed through spider territory and had to cross over the Enchanted River, whose waters could put one to sleep. That being said, many people did successfully pass through the forest. One's best bet was to get some guides, travel in a group, and don't stray from the path. Number 3. Moria. Moria, known more respectfully as Khazad-dûm, was for a long time the greatest dwarven city in existence, but as the story goes, the dwarves delved too greedily and too deep, and they awakened an unnamed terror which had slept dormant beneath the city. After losing 2 of their kings in quick succession, the dwarves abandoned the city, and it soon became home to orcs and trolls too. In the late Third Age, Balin briefly recovered the city, but within 5 years it had failed, and Balin and all of his colonists were dead. Realistically, Moria was far from the only dangerous place in the Misty Mountains. This list could easily include places like Goblin Town and Gundabad. They were actually home to far more orcs than Moria, which is actually stated to have been comparatively lightly populated. But that ignores the other dangers that lurked within Moria. One was the Watcher in the Water, which guarded the West Gate after the waters rose there. But the most infamous danger was Durin's Bane, the Balrog, which made any real attempt to retake Moria impossible until it was defeated by Gandalf. In most cases, Moria was easily avoidable. One can either avoid the mountains entirely by taking the Gap of Rohan, or one can take the High Pass or the Redhorn Pass. Unfortunately, when none of these options are possible, Moria is the only option, provided you can get through the West Gate. Despite its danger, once inside, an individual or small group could survive in Moria undetected. Gandalf and Aragorn both did it in the past, and Gollum survived there for a while too. But survival becomes far less likely if you alert the orcs, and almost impossible if you alert Durin's Bane. Luckily, the Fellowship had Gandalf with them. Number 2, Mordor. Mordor has long been the terrifying name in the back of the minds of all the Free Peoples. A volcanic wasteland surrounded by impassable mountains, it became a natural home to Sauron's power. After he was defeated, the land was watched, but could not be truly destroyed or conquered. Eventually, this watch failed, and evil crept back into Mordor, and by the time of the War of the Ring, it was once again Sauron's main base of power, home to his vast legions of orcs, trolls, wargs, and who knows what else. The danger of Mordor is rather self-explanatory. In fact, it's extremely difficult to even get into Mordor. One must find a way through the Black Gate, or the Morgul Pass, or the long eastern route through enemy-controlled lands, or risk a run-in with Shelob by taking the pass of Cirith Ungol. Once inside, you have Sauron's innumerable legions either encamped or marching to war, and then there's Sauron himself, the sleepless evil who can spot you even if his servants can't, so you better hope his focus is turned elsewhere. Even without Sauron and his servants, Golgoroth is a volcanic wasteland where misadventure would not be too hard to come by. Like I explained, Mordor was chosen and guarded in a way that made it nigh impossible to get to, so it's not like you could just accidentally wander in. But what makes Mordor so dangerous is that it can attack you easily, but is hard to attack in return. In other words, while you would not go to Mordor, Mordor could easily come to you, especially for the people of Gondor, who were forced to look at the darkness across the Anduin almost every day of their existence. Number 1, Minas Morle. If Mordor is not number 1, then what could it be? Well, none other than Minas Morle. Minas Morle was once Minas Ithil, the pride of Isildur, one of Gondor's primary cities, but the city was vulnerable, even being captured briefly by Sauron in the Second Age. In the Third Age, it gradually declined in population and importance, and in the year 2000, it was suddenly besieged by the Nazgul, who issued forth from Mordor. 2 years later, the city fell and became Minas Morle, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, a perpetual thorn in Gondor's side. So what makes Minas Morle even more dangerous than Mordor? Well, Minas Morle is like the worst of Mordor, but condensed into a small valley. The city itself is the home of the Nazgul, and legions of orcs and other creatures. But the real evil in Minas Morle isn't even the orcs, it's the corrupted nature of the valley itself. It's said that the waters of the Morgul Dwyn are poisonous to drink. Keep in mind, even Mordor has drinkable water, and the river lets off cold vapours that can make you physically ill. The flowers in the fields are strangely beautiful, but fill the air with noxious fumes that can quickly drive a man mad. So horribly corrupted was Minas Morle that when Aragorn and the host of the West arrived, Aragorn ordered the bridge across the Morgul Dwyn destroyed, and he ordered his soldiers to set the fields on fire. He then decreed that after the war was over, the city wouldn't even be resettled. No, it would be totally destroyed, because it would take generations for the valley to even become habitable again. Minas Morle and the surrounding valley might be one of the most corrupted places to ever exist in Middle-earth. Middle-earth's Chernobyl, if you will. And that completes the list, but I want to bring up some honourable mentions that missed out. One is Fangorn. While we associate it with the Ents, who are mostly good guys, Treebeard does mention that some parts of the forest are very dark and dangerous, possibly twisted and corrupted, who knows. The Old Forest is also no walk in the park either. Keep in mind, Frodo and his companions were almost strangled to death by a tree. Emyn Muil is another shout, a barren rocky maze of hills where one could easily get lost or fall to their death. And I can imagine Lobelia Sackville Baggins' house was a fairly dangerous place too. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. Once again, I will say that this is a personal opinion and you're not incorrect if you disagree with some of the placings. Personally, I think Minas Morle and Mordor are well placed. Moria and Merkwood could be swapped, 5 to 8 are probably all interchangeable, and 9 and 10 could probably also be swapped too. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're looking for the 10 most dangerous places on Earth, 2 to 10 are public toilets, and 1 is any Italian main road.